if that second driver, I'll call him, a passenger driver, drives on any part of that trip, he's not cushioning. Well, you call it cushioning, but he can't use travel time, let's put it that way, because he has been a co-driver on that trip. So that's not travel time. Now, if he stays in the passenger seat the whole trip, takes 8 hours off the other end, that's travel time all the way. But if you're flipping the drivers back and forth, one occasionally helps the other one out, that's interrupting travel time concept. Yeah.
Sorry, go back one slide for me. There's one of the definitions, no, back one more, I guess. There's one of the definitions kind of conflicts with this because
up there where it says, but not driving or assuming any other responsibility to the carrier. Driving is defined as being behind the wheels of a commercial motor vehicle. So if a person is driving a non-commercial vehicle, then technically they're not driving as defined. And that was we've made changes in our company a few years ago about this, but the way the definition reads of driving, you're in a commercial vehicle. So that was kind of confusing. Because a person would drive a non-commercial vehicle traveling and then have 8 hours off. Technically, according to that, it would seem that it would be an off-duty thing.
Right, that's come up again, and what is frustrating in the world when you bring the lawyers into play is that they sometimes will say that the word driving in this context is not the same as the word driving is defined elsewhere. And that's where regulatory guidance has to come into play. And that is the way they look at this one. Now, sometimes I don't think we have regulatory guidance on that. I'm sure we don't. It may be added if necessary at some point. But the driving here is not taken narrowly. You run into that. Right, yeah. Oh, yeah. And you get into that all the time. I mean, your employees, among yourselves, among ourselves, we debate all the time exactly what a rule means. And again, when you bring the lawyers in, research the history a lot of times of the rule, that can be very interesting. Sometimes the language changed a little bit unintentionally. Sometimes back when the rule was in one part, it was part of a series that made it clear that it meant something different at that time. And later somebody moved the parts around, and now it doesn't seem to mean what it means, what it meant back then. So you're right, that's a problem area.
If I can interject, one of the things and of course Tom and I have had this conversation, I don't know how many times, but one of the things I like to say is, if you're on a cushion, it's to obtain rest, whether it's a plane, train, or automobile. But when you get behind that vehicle, then you're performing a duty to get that vehicle from one location to the other. And the driving part is still, you've got to pay attention, you've got to stay alert. You're not over there, reading your phone or with your head resting against the window. So that is very, misleading. And a lot of carriers that I find will want to use that travel time, move it up to off-duty, even though they're driving that personal vehicle or an automobile, a company automobile, except rental car, etc. So if you're not driving a CNV, it can also be looked at as you're performing another responsibility. Your responsibility is to get that vehicle from point A to point B. What's your top thoughts on that?
No, and that is the way we're reading it nowadays, but we need to get that into regulatory guidance preferably. What another situation happens is sometimes, and it's unfortunate, but a carrier will write into us, and we reply in kind is the way we put it. If you ask us a question in the hallway, we'll answer it in the hallway. If you want to call us on the phone, we might answer you on the phone. You can't call us on the phone and ask us to send you a letter. But if you send in a signed written letter asking a particular scenario, problem like that, we will get you an answer. And the difference is that the only way we can send out a letter, it has to be approved by the lawyers and everybody else. So sometimes the answers in those letters differ from what people's understanding is. When a letter like that goes out, For example, if we answered it this way, that said that driving a personal vehicle interrupts travel time, it's on duty. If we said that in the letter, that really should be put into regulatory guidance so everybody knows about it. So we try to be careful of that.
It was explained to me by one of your counterparts, it's pretty simple to understand, that if I'm driving a commercial motor vehicle, right, then these regulations apply to me for hours of service, correct? So if I'm driving a rental car, it doesn't apply as driving time, right?
Oh, I see it, yeah, different way of explaining the same point.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so that helped me understand the regulations, all right? So if I'm not driving a commercial motor vehicle, it'll be on duty not driving time in that rental car.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
You just remember that way, while your questions are answered.
That works. Now, that's the kind of thing we need to get into regulatory guidance preferably. We got some other questions, we'll try to.
Mr. Yeager, is there an FMCSA interpretation as to the distance that can be traveled under the personal conveyance? Is it 50 miles, 100 miles, 1,000 miles?
There's none, and regulatory guidance cannot be specific like that. If we tried to put a number in regulatory guidance that was not in the rule, that would not be valid regulatory guidance. So we can't use regulatory guidance to change the rule. We can interpret a little bit and try to explain it, but we can't put specific numbers in like that. So but Canada has a specific miles numbers. To us, it doesn't make sense to have miles, some of us, because that doesn't have anything to do with the nature of your activity. It should be, are you driving for personal reasons or for business reasons? And it doesn't matter how many miles if you look at it that way. But to answer your question, there is no mileage figure there, and we can't put one in regulatory guidance.
The rule says that short distances, that's very vague.
Yes, but we often use, not often, but we sometimes use terms like short distances or reasonable distances. That still is valid because it chops off the end. If you say reasonable, there is a legal concept, and again, if you say reasonable, that means, I'm not going to apply it to a particular rule, but if I had in my mind 5 miles or something, and I don't say anything other than reasonable, if you run 500 miles and you ask other people, is that reasonably what they meant? Say, no, they didn't mean 500 miles. So they're still valid terms, but there's no cutoff point.
The ELDs that we're putting in place are the AORBDs now, I guess. But when we use personal conveyance, it's set up that they have to return to the original point where the personal conveyance was started before they can use that. So for instance, if the bus drops off people and you use it for personal conveyance to go to the restaurant, and then you have to go back to where the people are, where you drop the people off before you can end the personal conveyance. And then, so that way, Rick gave me an example earlier, where a person would go to eat and then go fuel. Well, they've used personal conveyance to go eat, but then they're on duty for fueling. So basically they would have had to travel that distance to fuel anyway, so it would have had to been on duty. So that's the way our personal conveyance is set up. Does that sound right?
You're going to get into all those kind of scenarios, and Danielle's been running into some of them. And again, it never came up in the past because it wasn't being recorded quite so precisely. But there are a lot of scenarios like that. A driver will say, I'm allowed to take the company vehicle home on the weekend as long as I get it washed and get the fuel oil changed and some things like that, some maintenance work. Well, does that put them off and on? Yes, it does. Obviously, that's on duty time, but maybe the trip getting home, that's where it becomes questionable. Is that still legitimate personal conveyance? There's going to be a lot of issues on that. Again, it goes back to, I think, that when we try to start narrowing it down, it will come back So is it personal or is it related to your job? Now, when you mix them, that becomes more difficult.
So along
Well,
those same lines, if a driver is allowed to take a bus home, he drops his last passengers off and then drives 30 miles to go home with no reason to go there except to go home and go to sleep, can that be personal conveyance?
Yes. Yeah, again, if the company's authorizing to take the bus home, and that's just his personal activity, he would have to go home. Now, if he drove 300 miles with that bus to some temporary, to motel or something, I want to say that that was his personal trip, that's not a good scenario, but yes, if he's going home, again, there's going to be questions raised, why, considered the amount of fuel that's used and everything else, why is he taking the bus home? Now, if he's going to leave home and go on his next dispatch, that's a whole nother story. If you let him take the bus home because you know the next dispatch is going that direction, then that's a no-no. So you have to look at the whole big picture.
I was just gonna kind of add to that, but when you talked about, now leaving home, going to pick up your next, group, so you covered that one. But, I guess that's probably the problem of us being around for so long, we've never had that definition that pinpointed the time frame, the distance, et cetera, of that personal conveyance. So we've always had these understood portions. So it's all a case-by-case, scenario. And I believe the regulatory guidance, if I understand, that's going to be published is that we've answered enough of these letters throughout the years. We're going to try to compile those into a document that will include some of these scenarios to give, better clarification. But just like using the vehicle to go home and then taking it to your next pickup, to your next group. Same with the eating scenario. You did the personal conveyance to eat, but now you gotta go to fuel because that's your responsibility. So now that situation changes. But yes, once upon a time, we always did discuss that it would begin and end, in the same location because you're taking on the thought process with passengers. You gotta go back and pick them up. So, you ended there, now you're going back to pick them up. But with all the different scenarios, once again, we'll get more clarification hopefully soon, but it's still a case-by-case situation.
Yeah, the regulatory guidance coming out will not be able to answer a lot of these questions. And again, it'll still come back to, and one other factor we look at is the intent here. Is somebody just trying to get away with something by inserting some piece of activity in the middle of something else? Was there a real good reason for doing that? And, people are going to look at that a little more questionably.
And with implementation of the ELD rule, you don't have to give your drivers personal conveyance. That's your option to allow them to use that or not. If you're wanting to run that tight ship, the rule for the personal conveyance and yard moves is in there, for you to give your drivers that ability. But, you don't have to use that. But the ELD has to be configured, we'll talk about in that technical specification, to allow that if you so want to do that. You don't have to let them use that.
I just know if anybody was taking a motor coach home and back and forth to home, I would look very closely at why are they doing that? If it's conveying to the business. It sounds unusual. That's no reason. You got a question right here?
Yeah, mine's just, you're going to define reasonable, correct? Because if I'm standing in a room of 100 drivers and I'm trying to explain to them reasonable, to me, it just becomes a nightmare.
You don't define reasonable. You say, I know what you're getting at, and it is difficult, but you cut off the extremes. That's all you can say when you use the word reasonable. If the concept, most people look at it as to what most people would think is reasonable. That's the way the courts do it. What a reasonable man on the street would think. If most of those drivers in the room or you all here today thought that 50 miles sounds reasonable to us, well, we're not going to define reasonable as 50 miles. but we're gonna say, based on that concept, 500 miles can't be reasonable if everybody thinks 50 is. We don't know if 75, who knows on that? And 5 miles can't be reasonable if everybody thinks 50 is reasonable. So you're talking off the extremes, that's the best you can do when you talk reasonable. And it's done that way a lot, believe it or not. Most people knows what's reasonable. Yeah, and sometimes,
Carrie, you can set your own policies. And, once again, like, going and doing investigations, I've seen where a large carrier, had a driver that was out on the road that had a family member, had a serious medical condition. And when they called in, they were within 200 miles. That seems a little extreme, but they allowed that driver to drop that trailer at their nearest super center. They allowed him personal conveyance to go directly home, with that vehicle. So once again, that doesn't seem reasonable. But if you've got a family member that has a serious medical condition, and that carrier is going to allow you to take that vehicle home to attend to that serious, medical condition, how can we argue with that? Because they did what they were supposed to do to relieve that document.
yeah.
So, that is,
Yeah. It comes
so
back
that
to
is
what-
kind of like where I guess we need to take that until, because we can't give, I don't know, I've been involved with the rulemaking process, and I'll never know it all. Don't even try to learn it all. But, I do know that, like we talked about, to say Canada says 75 kilometers. We can do that, from what I understand, without, rulemaking and justification and cost analysis and, so that's just kind of like where we are. So if you have an extreme circumstance like that, document it, explain, why this happened. But if you want to allow your driver to do something like that to accommodate them in an emergency situation, then document it.
And remember, we do have a regulation that says you can always have stricter policy, company policies. You can be more strict than the rules. So there's no problem with that. You may have a bigger argument with your driver, that's a different issue. As far as rules go, they can't point to a rule and say you have to do this.